Marcus Henderson cast his line into the murky waters of Chesapeake Harbor the same way he had every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. The old wooden dock creaked beneath his weathered boots as he settled into his familiar routine. What he didn't expect was for 6 fully armed Navy SEALs to emerge from the depths, water streaming from their tactical gear, and render him the most respectful salute of his life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But to understand why these elite warriors honored a simple fisherman that morning, we need to go back to where it all began. Marcus Henderson had never wanted to be a hero. At 54, he was content with his quiet life in the small coastal town of Millfield, Virginia. His days followed a predictable pattern. Wake at dawn, grab his tackle box and thermos of black coffee, and head down to the old pier that jutted out into Chesapeake Harbor. The wooden planks were sun-bleached and splintered from decades of salt air, but they held his weight just fine. This particular Tuesday started like any other. The morning mist hung low over the water, and the only sounds were the gentle lapping of waves against the dock supports and the distant cry of seagulls circling overhead. Marcus had been coming to this exact spot since his retirement from the Millfield Fire Department 3 years ago. The pension wasn't much, but it was enough to cover his modest needs, and fishing had become his meditation. He baited his hook with a piece of shrimp and cast out toward the deeper water where the harbor channel curved around Gull Point. The familiar weight of the rod in his calloused hands brought him peace. These quiet morning hours were his sanctuary, a place where the memories of 30 years fighting fires couldn't reach him. Marcus had seen things during his career that most people only witnessed in nightmares. House fires that claimed entire families. Industrial accidents that left workers trapped in twisted metal. The chemical plant explosion of 2019 that had tested every emergency responder in 3 counties. But out here on the water, with nothing but the gentle tug of the current on his line, those images seemed to fade into the morning fog. He checked his watch. 6:47 a.m. Right on schedule. Marcus took a sip of his coffee and adjusted his position on the folding chair he'd brought from home. The chair had belonged to his late wife, Sarah, who used to sit beside him during their weekend fishing trips before the cancer took her 2 years ago. Now he brought it every Tuesday, partly for comfort and partly because he couldn't bear to leave it gathering dust in the garage. The first bite came 20 minutes later. A gentle tug, then nothing. Marcus waited, knowing from experience that patience was the difference between going home empty-handed and filling his cooler. The fish in Chesapeake Harbor had grown smarter over the years, more cautious. Too many weekend warriors with their loud boats and fancy equipment had spooked them into the deeper channels. As he waited for another bite, Marcus noticed unusual activity near the naval training facility that occupied the far shore of the harbor. Normally, the base was quiet this early in the morning, but today he could see lights moving along the waterline and what looked like several small craft positioned just beyond the breakwater. He'd lived in Millfield long enough to know that the Navy conducted training exercises in these waters, but they usually announced them in the local paper to warn recreational boaters. Marcus reeled in his line to check the bait. The shrimp was gone, stolen by some clever fish while he'd been distracted. He reached into his tackle box for another piece, his movements automatic after decades of practice. The tackle box itself was an antique, a gift from his father when Marcus turned 16. The metal was dented, and the latches were loose, but it still held everything he needed. As he prepared his hook, Marcus caught sight of movement in the water about 50 yards out. At first, he thought it might be a seal or dolphin. Both were common in the harbor during certain seasons. But as he watched more carefully, he realized the movement was too deliberate, too purposeful for marine life. Bubbles began breaking the surface in a distinct pattern, forming a rough line parallel to the shore. Marcus set down his rod and reached for the small binoculars he kept in his tackle box. Through the lenses, he could make out dark shapes moving beneath the surface, multiple figures swimming in perfect formation. This was definitely military. Marcus had enough experience with emergency response coordination to recognize a tactical operation when he saw one. The swimmers were maintaining precise spacing and moving with the kind of discipline that only came from extensive training. Whatever they were doing, it was clearly part of some larger exercise. Marcus lowered his binoculars and picked up his rod again. Military training exercises were none of his business. and he had no intention of interfering with their work. He'd always maintained a respectful relationship with the personnel at the naval facility, occasionally nodding to the patrol boats that made their rounds through the harbor. Live and let live had always been his philosophy. But as he cast out his line again, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this exercise. In his 3 years of regular fishing at this spot, he'd never seen divers operating this close to the civilian areas of the harbor. The naval facility had plenty of open water on their side of the bay for training purposes. The morning continued its peaceful rhythm. Marcus caught 2 small flounder, both of which he released back into the water. Catch and release had become his standard practice since Sarah's death. Cooking for one had never held much appeal, and he found more satisfaction in the act of fishing itself than in keeping the results. Around 8:30, the activity near the naval facility intensified. More lights appeared along the shoreline, and Marcus could hear the distant sound of engines starting up. Through his binoculars, he watched as several rigid inflatable boats moved into position around the training area. Whatever exercise was underway was clearly reaching its climax. Marcus was reaching for his thermos when he heard the sound of breaking water much closer than expected. He turned toward the noise and froze. 6 figures in full combat gear were emerging from the harbor directly in front of his position, water streaming from their black wetsuits and tactical equipment. They moved with mechanical precision, rising from the depths like something out of a military thriller. The lead figure reached the rocky shoreline first, followed immediately by the others. They were clearly Navy SEALs, based on their equipment and the systematic way they moved. Marcus had seen enough military personnel during joint emergency response operations to recognize elite special forces when he saw them. What happened next would be burned into Marcus Henderson's memory for the rest of his life. The lead SEAL spotted Marcus sitting on the dock about 30 feet away. Instead of ignoring him or asking him to move along, the operator did something completely unexpected. He removed his diving mask, revealing the face of a young man who couldn't have been more than 25 years old. Then, with water still dripping from his gear, he snapped to attention and rendered Marcus a crisp military salute. One by one, the other 5 SEALs followed suit. They lined up in perfect formation on the rocky shore, removed their masks, and saluted the surprised fishermen with the kind of respect typically reserved for high-ranking officers or fallen heroes. Marcus sat frozen in his folding chair, fishing rod forgotten in his hands, staring at 6 of America's most elite warriors paying him honor he couldn't begin to understand. The morning mist swirled around the scene, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere as the SEALs held their salute for a full 10 seconds before the team leader finally spoke. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Henderson. Semper Fi." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. These men knew who he was. Somehow, these Navy SEALs, conducting what he'd assumed was a routine training exercise, had not only recognized him, but felt compelled to honor him in this extraordinary way. But Marcus Henderson had never served in the military. He'd been a firefighter, nothing more. How could they possibly know him, and why would they show him this level of respect? The SEALs disappeared back into the water as quickly as they had emerged, leaving Marcus alone on the dock, with 1,000 questions racing through his mind. He stared at the spot where they had stood, wondering if the entire encounter had been some kind of hallucination brought on by too much morning coffee and solitude. But the words echoed in his head with crystal clarity. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Henderson. Semper Fi." Marcus packed his gear with shaking hands, his peaceful morning routine shattered by the mysterious encounter. The drive home took him through downtown Millfield, past the familiar storefronts and tree-lined streets that had been his world for over 2 decades. Everything looked exactly the same, but Marcus felt like he was seeing it all through different eyes. His small ranch house on Maple Street welcomed him with its usual silence. Sarah's garden still bloomed in the front yard, tended now by their neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who couldn't bear to see the flowers die. Marcus dropped his tackle box by the front door and headed straight for his home office, a converted bedroom where he kept his computer and filing cabinets. If those SEALs knew who he was, there had to be a reason. Marcus began digging through old files, searching for any connection to military operations during his firefighting career. He pulled out incident reports, commendation letters, and newspaper clippings that documented 3 decades of emergency response work. The chemical plant explosion came to mind first. August 15, 2019 had been the hottest day of the summer when Consolidated Chemicals' main processing facility erupted in a fireball that could be seen from 20 miles away. Marcus had been the incident commander that day, coordinating response efforts from multiple agencies while toxic smoke billowed into the sky. He found the file and spread the contents across his desk. Photos showed the devastation: twisted metal, demolished buildings, and emergency vehicles scattered across the industrial complex like toys. The official report listed 17 civilian casualties and over 40 injuries, but Marcus remembered the numbers differently. He remembered the people. There was Jennifer Walsh, the secretary who had been trapped under debris for 6 hours before they could extract her. Tommy Rodriguez, the maintenance worker who had suffered third-degree burns over 60% of his body. And then there were the ones they couldn't save. The night shift supervisor who had been making his rounds when the explosion occurred, the security guard who had run back into the building to check for stragglers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But as Marcus studied the documents, he found no mention of military involvement. The disaster had been handled entirely by civilian emergency services, fire departments from 3 counties, state hazmat teams, and federal environmental specialists. No Navy, no SEALs, no reason for those men to know his name. The afternoon stretched into evening as Marcus continued his search. He pulled out files from other major incidents: the apartment complex fire that had displaced 200 families, the highway pileup during the ice storm of 2018, the warehouse collapse that had required a week-long recovery operation. Each case brought back vivid memories of smoke and chaos, of desperate voices calling for help, of split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. Yet nowhere in his records could Marcus find any connection to military operations or personnel that would explain the morning's encounter. He was about to give up when he remembered something that wasn't in any official file, something that had happened during the chemical plant disaster that he'd never reported because it hadn't seemed relevant at the time. On the second day of the emergency response, when the fires were finally under control but hazmat teams were still working to contain the toxic spill, Marcus had encountered a group of men who didn't quite fit with the other responders. They wore standard hazmat suits like everyone else, but something about their bearing, their discipline, and the way they moved suggested military training. At the time, Marcus had assumed they were federal specialists or perhaps contractors with security clearances high enough to work around classified materials. Consolidated Chemical had several government contracts, and it wasn't unusual for federal agencies to send their own experts to major industrial accidents. But now, thinking back with the clarity that comes from years of distance, Marcus realized those men had been operating with the kind of precision and coordination that only came from elite military units. They had worked in perfect synchronization, communicating through subtle hand signals, and maintaining security protocols that went far beyond standard hazmat procedures. Marcus remembered one interaction in particular. He had been coordinating with various team leaders when one of the mysterious specialists approached him. The man's face was hidden behind a respirator, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. He had asked specific questions about evacuation routes, wind patterns, and the timeline for containing the spill. Questions that suggested he was concerned about more than just environmental damage. "Commander Henderson," the man had said, using Marcus's incident command title, "we need to discuss potential secondary hazards." They had talked for perhaps 10 minutes about the possibility of additional explosions and the risk to nearby residential areas. The specialist had been professional and knowledgeable, but there had been something in his voice that suggested he was thinking about threats that went beyond typical industrial accidents. At the time, Marcus had filed the conversation away as just another interaction in a chaotic situation, but now he wondered if those men had been military personnel conducting some kind of classified assessment of the disaster. If Consolidated Chemical had been working on sensitive government contracts, the explosion might have compromised more than just industrial equipment. As darkness fell over Millfield, Marcus found himself standing in his backyard, staring up at the stars and trying to piece together fragments of memory. The chemical plant explosion had been thoroughly investigated by state and federal authorities, but the final reports had been heavily redacted. Entire sections had been blacked out, supposedly to protect proprietary information about Consolidated Chemical's manufacturing processes. What if those redactions had hidden something more significant? What if the company had been involved in defense work that required military oversight? And what if Marcus's role as incident commander had somehow intersected with a classified operation in ways he had never understood? The questions multiplied in his mind like ripples spreading across still water. Marcus realized that tomorrow he would have to do something he had been avoiding for 3 years. He would have to talk to people who might have answers. His first call would be to Chief Patricia Reynolds, his former boss at the fire department. Pat had been the one who approved Marcus's early retirement after Sarah's diagnosis, and she had access to incident reports that might contain details he had forgotten. If anyone could help him understand what had happened at the chemical plant, it would be Pat. His second call would be more difficult. Detective Ray Morrison of the Millfield Police Department had been the lead investigator on several cases where Marcus had served as incident commander. Ray had contacts throughout the federal law enforcement community, and he might be able to shed light on whether military personnel had been involved in any of their joint operations. Marcus went to bed that night with his mind racing, but sleep eventually came. His dreams were filled with images of fire and smoke, of faceless figures in hazmat suits, and of 6 Navy SEALs emerging from dark water to honor him for reasons he couldn't comprehend. When he woke the next morning, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of driving to the harbor for his usual fishing routine, he would begin the search for answers. He had no idea that his investigation would uncover a story that reached into the highest levels of national security, or that the simple act of doing his job 3 years ago had prevented a catastrophe that could have changed the course of American history. The truth was waiting for him, hidden in classified files and the memories of men and women who had sworn oaths to protect secrets that could never be fully revealed. But Marcus Henderson, the quiet fisherman who had never wanted to be a hero, was about to discover that sometimes heroes are made not by seeking glory, but by simply doing what's right when everything else is falling apart. Marcus arrived at the Millfield Fire Department headquarters at 8 a.m. sharp, carrying a manila folder containing copies of every document he could find related to the consolidated chemical incident. Chief Patricia Reynolds was already at her desk, her silver hair pulled back in the same no-nonsense style she'd worn for the past 15 years. "Marcus Henderson," she said, looking up from her computer screen with a mixture of surprise and concern. "What brings you back to this madhouse?" Pat Reynolds had run the department with an iron fist wrapped in genuine care for her people. She'd fought budget battles with city council, defended her firefighters against political pressure, and somehow managed to keep morale high, despite being chronically understaffed and underfunded. When Sarah's cancer had progressed rapidly, Pat had personally arranged Marcus's early retirement package, cutting through bureaucratic red tape to ensure his pension remained intact. "I need to ask you about something that's been bothering me," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "about the chemical plant explosion." Pat's expression shifted subtly, her practiced administrative smile fading into something more guarded. "That was a hell of a thing. You did good work that day, Marcus. Saved a lot of lives." "That's just it," Marcus replied, opening his folder. "I've been going through my files, and there are gaps in my memory, things that don't quite add up." He spread out copies of incident reports, witness statements, and newspaper clippings across Pat's desk. "Do you remember those federal specialists who showed up on day 2? The ones in the hazmat suits who seemed to know more about the facility than our own hazmat team?" Pat leaned back in her chair, her fingers drumming against the armrest. "Marcus, you know I can't discuss ongoing federal investigations." "Ongoing?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "Pat, that was 3 years ago. What investigation could still be active?" Chief Reynolds stood up and walked to her office door, closing it firmly before returning to her desk. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. 6 months after the explosion, I got a visit from 2 men in expensive suits. They had credentials from agencies I'd never heard of, and questions about your performance during the incident. They wanted copies of your personnel file, your incident command decisions, even your psychological evaluation from after the disaster. Marcus felt the room tilt slightly. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That you were the best incident commander I'd ever worked with. That your decisions saved dozens of lives that day. That if they were looking for someone to blame, they were barking up the wrong tree." Pat opened her desk drawer and pulled out a business card, its edges worn from handling. One of them left this. Said if you ever ask questions about that day, I should have you call this number. The card was plain white, with only a phone number printed in black ink. No name, no agency identification, no government seal. Marcus stared at it, feeling like he was holding a piece of a puzzle he didn't even know he was trying to solve. They knew I'd eventually start asking questions. Quote, "Apparently," Pat's voice carried a weight of concern. "Marcus, what happened? Why are you digging into this now?" Marcus told her about the encounter at the dock, about the seals who had emerged from the water to salute him. As he spoke, Pat's expression grew increasingly troubled. "Jesus, Marcus, you've stumbled into something way above our pay grade." 2 hours later, Marcus sat in his car outside the fire station, staring at the mysterious business card. His hands shook slightly as he dialed the number. The phone rang once before a crisp male voice answered. "Mr. Henderson, we've been expecting your call." "Who is this?" "My name is Commander David Blackwood, United States Navy. I believe we need to meet. Are you familiar with the Overlook Diner on Route 13? Marcus knew the place. A truck stop restaurant about 20 miles outside Millfield where travelers could get coffee and pie at any hour. "I can be there in 30 minutes. "Come alone, Mr. Henderson, and bring your incident reports from the chemical plant." The Overlook Diner was nearly empty when Marcus arrived. Commander Blackwood was easy to spot. A man in his early 40s wearing civilian clothes that couldn't quite hide his military bearing. He sat in a corner booth with a clear view of the parking lot and both exits. "Thank you for coming," Blackwood said as Marcus slid into the opposite seat. "I apologize for the secrecy, but what we need to discuss involves matters of national security." A waitress approached, but Blackwood waved her away with a polite smile. "Perhaps some privacy?" When they were alone, Blackwood reached into a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder marked with classification stamps Marcus had never seen before. "Mr. Henderson, what I'm about to tell you is classified at the highest levels. You'll be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and the penalties for violating that agreement are severe. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, his mouth suddenly dry. 3 years ago, Consolidated Chemical was operating under a classified contract with the Department of Defense. They were developing a new type of chemical compound for use in advanced weapon systems. The explosion you responded to wasn't an industrial accident, it was a terrorist attack. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Terrorist attack? A sleeper cell had infiltrated the facility. Their plan was to detonate the chemical storage area during peak production hours, when the maximum amount of toxic material would be released into the atmosphere. If they had succeeded, the death toll would have been in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands. Blackwood opened the file and showed Marcus satellite photos of the explosion site. Your decision to establish the evacuation perimeter where you did and your coordination of the emergency response prevented a catastrophe that could have made 9/11 look like a minor incident. Marcus studied the photos, seeing the disaster from a perspective he'd never imagined. "But I was just doing my job." "No, Mr. Henderson. You made decisions that day that went beyond standard protocol. You evacuated a wider area than required. You brought in additional resources faster than any incident commander in our simulations. You somehow intuited that this wasn't a normal industrial accident." The men in hazmat suits. "My team. We were conducting a classified assessment of the site, trying to determine if additional attacks were planned. You worked with us seamlessly, even though you had no idea who we were or what we were really doing there." Blackwood closed the file and leaned forward. "The SEALs who saluted you yesterday were part of the team that eventually tracked down the terrorist cell. Every one of them studied your incident command decisions as part of their training. To them, you're not just a retired firefighter. You're the man whose quick thinking prevented one of the worst domestic terror attacks in American history." Marcus sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what he was hearing. All these years, he'd carried guilt about the people who died in the explosion, wondering if he could have done more. Now he was learning that his actions had actually saved thousands of lives. "The compound they were targeting," Blackwood continued, pulling out another document, "was designated XK7. It's a binary chemical weapon that becomes lethal when mixed with common industrial solvents. The terrorists had calculated that a controlled explosion would create an aerosol cloud covering roughly 40 square miles of populated area." Marcus examined the wind pattern charts and population density maps spread before him. Red zones marked areas that would have been affected if his evacuation perimeter had been smaller, if he hadn't brought in hazmat teams from neighboring counties, if he hadn't made the controversial decision to shut down Interstate 64 during rush hour. The cell leader was a chemical engineer named Hassan al-Rashid, Blackwood explained. He'd been working at the plant for 18 months, building detailed knowledge of their security protocols and production schedules. His team had positioned explosive devices at 3 critical junctions in the facility's ventilation system. How many people were in the terrorist cell? 7. Al-Rashid and 6 others, all with clean backgrounds and legitimate employment histories. They'd been planning this operation for over 2 years. Blackwood's expression darkened. What made it particularly dangerous was their patience. They waited for the perfect storm of conditions. Maximum chemical storage, favorable wind patterns, and a shift change that would put the most people at risk. Marcus thought back to that sweltering August morning when his radio had crackled with the first reports of explosions at the chemical plant. He remembered the sick feeling in his stomach when he'd seen the size of the initial fireball, the way the smoke had billowed in thick, unnatural colors that spoke of toxic compounds mixing in ways they were never meant to. "My gut told me something was wrong from the beginning," Marcus said. "The explosion pattern didn't match what I'd expect from an industrial accident. Too many simultaneous detonation points. Your instincts saved lives even before you knew what you were dealing with." Blackwood consulted his notes. "Standard protocol for a chemical plant emergency calls for a half-mile evacuation radius. You ordered a 2-mile perimeter within the first hour. I had a bad feeling about the wind patterns that day. That bad feeling prevented 15,000 people from being exposed to lethal concentrations of XK7. The meteorological data shows that if the terrorists had succeeded in their timeline, the toxic cloud would have reached downtown Millfield by noon. Schools, hospitals, shopping centers, all within the projected kill zone." The weight of those words settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket. 15,000 people. He tried to visualize that number. Every person in Millfield, plus the surrounding communities of Pine Ridge and Harbor View. Families at breakfast tables, children playing in backyards, elderly residents taking their morning medications. All of them are alive today because of decisions he'd made while operating on instinct and experience. "How did you stop them?" Marcus asked. "We didn't initially. The explosion went off as planned, but your rapid response contained the damage to a fraction of what they intended. That gave us time to trace their escape routes and communication networks." Blackwood pulled out surveillance photos showing a safe house on the outskirts of Richmond. The cell had planned to disappear immediately after the attack, but your containment efforts forced them to stick around longer than expected. They needed to assess whether their mission had succeeded. "And that's when you caught them?" 3 days later. Al-Rashid made the mistake of using a compromised phone to contact his handlers overseas. "We traced the signal to a warehouse in Richmond where the entire cell was preparing to flee the country." Blackwood's voice carried a note of satisfaction. "Thanks to your work at the scene, we were able to roll up not just the local cell, but their entire support network stretching back to Syria." Marcus absorbed this information, understanding for the first time that the chemical plant incident had been part of something much larger than a single terrorist attack. His role as incident commander had inadvertently disrupted an international terror operation. "The SEAL team that saluted you yesterday," Blackwood continued, "they were part of the unit that conducted the warehouse raid. They've studied your incident command decisions in their training scenarios. To them, you represent something important about American resilience, the idea that ordinary citizens can rise to extraordinary challenges when their communities are threatened." "Why tell me this now?" Marcus finally asked. "Because you deserve to know, and because those men needed to honor you properly." Blackwood smiled for the first time since they'd met. "That salute yesterday wasn't part of any training exercise, Mr. Henderson. Those SEALs requested permission to pay their respects to a true American hero." Blackwood reached into his briefcase one more time and withdrew a small wooden box. "This is from the families of the people whose lives you saved, the ones who know what really happened that day. It's not an official military decoration, but it carries the gratitude of 15,000 Americans who are alive today because of your actions." Marcus opened the box to find a simple medal crafted from steel, salvaged from the chemical plant wreckage. The inscription read, "To Marcus Henderson, whose courage under fire prevented catastrophe. From a grateful nation that will never forget." "There's one more thing," Blackwood said, his tone becoming more serious. "The terrorist organization behind this attack, they're still active. Different cells, different targets, but the same network. Your actions 3 years ago dealt them a significant blow, but they've regrouped. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying there might be other attacks? We're monitoring several potential threats. The intelligence we gathered from the Richmond raid has been invaluable, but these organizations adapt quickly. They learn from their failures. Blackwood leaned forward. That's why what happened at the harbor yesterday was so important. Those SEALs wanted to honor you because they know they might be called upon to stop the next attempt. Your example gives them hope that ordinary Americans will rise to meet extraordinary challenges. The conversation weighed heavily on Marcus as he processed the full scope of what he'd learned. The chemical plant explosion hadn't been the end of a story. It had been the beginning of an ongoing battle against threats most Americans would never know existed. What happens now? Marcus asked. Now you go back to your fishing, Blackwood replied with a slight smile. You've earned your retirement, Mr. Henderson. But know that your country remains grateful for your service, both past and future. Future? Men like you don't stop serving just because they change uniforms. If we ever need your expertise again, your knowledge of emergency response, your understanding of how terrorists think about soft targets, we know where to find you. As they prepared to leave the diner, Blackwood handed Marcus a secure phone number written on another plain business card. If you ever notice anything unusual around the naval facility, or if you see anything that doesn't feel right during your morning fishing trips, call this number immediately. Your instincts saved 15,000 lives once before. We're counting on them to help us again if necessary. Quote, as Marcus drove home through the familiar streets of Millfield, the world looked different again. Not because anything had changed, but because he finally understood his place in it. He wasn't just a retired firefighter who'd lost his wife and spent his days fishing alone. He was a man who had prevented a national tragedy, who had saved thousands of lives without ever knowing it. That evening, Marcus sat in his home office with the medal Blackwood had given him, turning the piece of salvaged steel over in his hands. The weight of it seemed to carry the gravity of 15,000 lives, 15,000 families who had gone about their daily routines on August 15, 2019, never knowing how close they had come to disaster. He thought about Mrs. Patterson next door, who had been tending her roses that morning. About the kids at Millfield Elementary, who had been starting their first day of school. About the morning commuters stuck in the traffic jam he'd created by shutting down the interstate. At the time, he'd received angry calls from the mayor about the economic disruption. Now he understood that every minute of that traffic delay had been another minute for the toxic cloud to dissipate harmlessly into the atmosphere. Marcus opened his laptop and began researching the names Blackwood had mentioned. Hassan al-Rashid's photograph showed an ordinary-looking man in his 30s, someone who could have passed for any of the engineers or technicians Marcus had worked with over the years. There was nothing in his expression that hinted at the destruction he had planned, the innocent lives he was willing to sacrifice for his cause. The XK7 compound was harder to research. Most of the information was classified or heavily redacted. But Marcus found enough declassified scientific papers to understand the basics. It was a binary weapon, harmless in its individual components but deadly when combined. The terrorists had planned to use the industrial explosion to mix the components and spread them across a wide area using the plant's own ventilation systems. A knock at his front door interrupted his research. Marcus opened it to find Detective Ray Morrison standing on his porch, looking uncomfortable and holding a manila envelope. "Ray, what brings you this late?" Morrison glanced around nervously before stepping inside. "Got a visit today from some federal types asking questions about you, Marcus. Thought you should know." Quote, they sat in Marcus's living room while Morrison explained his encounter with two agents who had wanted to know about Marcus's mental state, his financial situation, and whether he had shown any unusual interest in the chemical plant incident over the past 3 years. "I told them you were solid as a rock," Morrison said, "but they seemed particularly interested in your fishing routine. Asked a lot of questions about why you go to the same spot every Tuesday, whether you've ever been observed taking photographs or making notes." Marcus realized the implications immediately. The federal agents were conducting a security review, making sure he wasn't a threat, now that he knew classified information about the terrorist attack. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was being investigated for potential security risks after learning he was actually a national hero. "There's something else," Morrison continued, opening the envelope. "They left this with me and said to give it to you if you seem stable and trustworthy." Inside the envelope was a letter from Admiral Patricia Kellerman, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command. The official letterhead gave weight to words that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "Mr. Henderson, your actions on August 15, 2019 represent the finest traditions of American service and sacrifice. While operational security prevents us from publicly acknowledging your role in preventing the consolidated chemical attack, please know that your courage and quick thinking are remembered and honored by every member of our special operations community. The men who saluted you at Chesapeake Harbor were expressing the gratitude of a nation that can never fully repay its debt to you." The letter went on to explain that Marcus's name had been entered into a classified database of civilian heroes whose actions had prevented national security disasters. If anything ever happened to him, his story would be preserved for future generations of military and emergency response personnel to study and learn from. Morrison watched Marcus read the letter twice before speaking again. "Jesus, Marcus, what the hell did you do 3 years ago?" "My job," Marcus replied simply. "I just did my job." The next morning, Marcus returned to his usual spot on the dock, but everything felt different now. He cast his line into the familiar waters of Chesapeake Harbor and settled into his chair, Sarah's chair, with a peace he hadn't felt in years. But this time, he was also carrying the weight of knowledge and responsibility. As he waited for his first bite, Marcus noticed a young couple setting up their own fishing gear about 50 yards down the pier. The woman was pregnant, probably 6 or 7 months along, and her husband was patiently helping her adjust her rod and reel. They looked happy, excited about the life they were building together. Marcus realized they might have been among the 15,000 people whose lives he had saved, the woman's unborn child, the family they were planning, the future they were building. All of it possible because of decisions he had made during the worst day of his professional career. When the first bite came, Marcus smiled and began reeling in his catch. A modest bass. Nothing spectacular, but he felt a satisfaction that went beyond the simple pleasure of fishing. He was part of something larger now, connected to a network of protectors and guardians who worked in shadows to keep America safe. In the distance, a Navy patrol boat made its regular rounds through the harbor. As it passed, Marcus could see the crew on deck. They raised their hands in what appeared to be a casual wave, but Marcus now understood it was something more, a gesture of respect between professionals who understood the weight of service, whether in uniform or out. Marcus waved back, then returned to his fishing, but he also kept his eyes open, watching the shoreline and the water traffic with the trained awareness of someone who knew that threats could emerge from the most unexpected places. Commander Blackwood had been right. Men like Marcus Henderson didn't stop serving just because they changed uniforms. The secure phone number was tucked safely in his wallet, and the medal from the families of the 15,000 sat on his mantelpiece at home. But the real memorial to that day was all around him, in the laughter of children playing on the beach, in the busy traffic of morning commuters, in the simple pleasure of a pregnant couple enjoying a peaceful morning on the water. Marcus Henderson had never wanted to be a hero, but he had become one anyway, one decision at a time, in service to neighbors who would never know his name and a nation that could never fully repay its debt to him. And as he sat on the old wooden dock where Navy SEALs had emerged from the depths to honor him, he finally understood that sometimes the most important battles are won not by seeking glory, but by answering the call when duty demands everything you have to give. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.